All right. Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I see a lot of familiar faces that have returned for the third in our series, Hate Speech, How We Can Respond. This series is co-organized by Circle of Peace, a local initiative of diverse citizens seeking to strengthen the common bond of humanity across religious, ethnic, and cultural divides. I'm going to do a very brief introduction tonight, because they're going to tell you a little bit more about themselves and review the past two programs that Circle of Peace has partnered and produced with the library the last few months. So our facilitators this evening are Michael Anderson and Angela Vascholtz Anderson, and they are here tonight to tell you more. I'll let you take over.
Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. So welcome to the third in our three-part series on hate speech. All of us from Circle of Peace and the Fort Vancouver Regional Library want to thank you very much for braving the elements tonight and coming out to join us. Our aim in this series has been to foster dialogue and learning together about a topic that many observers of our democracy have described as deeply disturbing, and the latest test of our fundamental rights of expression guaranteed by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So that's our topic tonight. How can we respond? So my name is Michael Anderson. I'm a third-generation native of Vancouver. I grew up about a mile and a half from here. And I'm a former high school philosophy and language arts teacher in the Vancouver School District for 21 years. I went back to school to study sustainability ethics at PSU, and I'm currently a volunteer coach for the Ethics Bowl team at Vancouver School of Arts and Academics.
So my name is Angela Vascholtz Anderson. We are married, thus the Anderson shared name. I'm also a native of Vancouver, and my family has been here for about 100 years, so Vancouver is really a place that goes deep into our roots. I've worked as a high school English teacher, and currently I'm a teacher librarian at the Vancouver School of Arts and Academics. So one of the things that Michael and I really wanted to be clear about this evening is that we are not presenting tonight as experts on this topic. We're not trained specialists for counseling victims of hate speech. We are experienced as educators and researchers, and so we are really here to share what we have investigated about this topic, what we've learned, and we are deeply committed to presenting the information in a fair way, in a non-biased way, and in a way that can help all of you have some ideas about how you might go out into the world, either to study more, learn more, follow up on some of the resources that we have discovered and have available for you if you would like, and then also so you have some ideas about how you can act in the world in a multiple variety of ways. So as we mentioned earlier in the series, this is a really complex topic, and this is why we've worked with the library, with the public library here, to break it down into three parts. Tonight we will start with a brief recap of the first two sessions, then address the heart of tonight's topic, which is to dig deeper into how we can respond to so-called hate speech. And we'll have some strategies, both for the long term and also for in the moment interactions. We'll follow the timeline that we've given you here as closely as possible, so that we'll have time to first get some information, break into small groups, have some conversation and discussion time about questions we have offered you. And then there will be some time at the end for some Q&A, and also if we want to start thinking about how do we want to follow up as a community given all of this information and I think the tensions we're all experiencing in the public sphere right now. So please note that we have provided you with some note cards. If you don't have them, they're on the table back here. If you develop any questions during the presentation, please write them down. There's some little pencils over there too that you can use. And we should have some time at the breaks, either at 7 or 7-ish when we're finished with our presentation, or at 7:40 when we're wrapping up our conversation circles.
So in 1995, a group of everyday citizens in Billings, Montana, following an incident in which a Native American family's house was defaced with racist graffiti, organized their concern under the name Not in Our Town. Later incidents that year in Billings included the hostile disruption of church services at a local black church by skinheads, the toppling of Jewish gravestones at the local cemetery, and a brick thrown through a child's window on which a menorah was displayed. If you attended our first session on October 21st, you will have learned that these incidents are not protected by the First Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. And in a few minutes, we'll briefly recap the line that separates constitutionally protected hate speech from punishable crimes. One of the key takeaways from our research into this series was that hate crimes like vandalism, arson, malicious harassment, and incitement of violence against vulnerable and marginalized groups are usually preceded and enabled by so-called hate speech. So, understanding how we might effectively respond to hate speech incidents in our area when they occur is in our collective interest. So, the first 4 minutes of this PBS film that documented the community's struggle together to combat hateful messages in Billings captures some of the spirit we decided of why we decided to convene this discussion here at the library.
This is Billings, Montana. In the winter a few years ago, the people here found some simple ways to draw together by taking a stand against hate and intolerance. We told their story in a PBS special called Not in Our Town. Their actions inspired communities all over the country to do the same. When hate happens, or someone is attacked, or a church is burned, respond. Hate crimes happen every day in this country, but they're often ignored. People of Billings, Montana decided not to look the other way. And here's what they did that inspired other communities to do the same. When a Native American family's home was defaced with racist graffiti, 30 members of the Painters Union showed up to paint over it.
So many of the times, there's a cause, and I end up standing on the sidelines too much. I feel something, but I never really did a lot to do anything about anything. And I was really glad to help paint the house, and more so, to help convey a message to these guys that the community will not stand for that.
When services at an African American church were disrupted by skinheads, members of other religious denominations from throughout Billings attended to help secure the church.
Denomination didn't count, ethnic background didn't count, color of skin didn't count. It was just that we were one people in it all together as one. And they did rally around, let them know, hey, if you bite one, you bite us all.
Billings Police Chief Wayne Inman took a strong stand against the hate crimes and became actively involved in the community's response.
If a police chief doesn't take a visible and active role, then there's something, everything is all right. And these hate groups have learned to experience that if a community doesn't respond, then the community accepts. Silence is acceptance to them.
Hate flyers were posted near the synagogue, and the Jewish cemetery was desecrated. Then, a brick was thrown through the bedroom window of a 6-year-old boy who had placed a menorah there for Hanukkah.
I remember discussing it with the publisher of the Gazette the next morning after this had happened and saying that please make this front page news because I want people to understand what it's like to be Jewish.
I guess it was a question of looking for an image that kind of put this together. During the Second World War, the Danish team is reputed to have come out after the Jewish community there was forced to wear stars by the Nazi occupiers. That he was reported to have come out with a yellow star too.
The Billings Gazette printed a full-page menorah for townspeople to tear out and hang in their windows.
The good thing about this town is that everybody said that one day, let's get together. So what we're gonna do is put menorahs in our windows, and pretty soon everybody we knew had one.
By late December, nearly 10,000 people in Billings, Montana had menorahs in their windows.
I would like to have thought that if this had happened to my Native American community, that they would have put a Native American symbol in the window. If it happened to the gay and lesbian community, that they would have put a pink triangle in their window. I would have liked to have hoped or think that they would have done that.
There is great goodness in the world, but we need permission and ways to reach out.
I mean, after all, these are our neighbors. If somebody threw a brick through your neighbor's house in Montana, you run out there and try to stop them. Don't they do that anywhere else in the country?
In this particular case, I think the best part of this surfaced. I was very proud of knowing surfaced. Just one tiny candle we lit, and it wasn't much, but that was something.
I really like Billings, Montana a lot.
We're going to stop there and move on.
So, tonight, our presentation will address the two main points expressed in the library's advertising material. First, we will present a brief overview of effective strategies for overcoming impulsive judgments that eliminate the possibility for real communication. And secondly, we'll share some ways to respond to hate speech incidents in public, as well as ways to effectively support targets of hate speech. What this forum is not about, because it's important to be clear on that too, is this is not about a defense of any group's political agenda. It's not an excuse to grandstand by us or an invitation to do so. It is not an evening that's designed to present expert psychological counsel on conflict resolution or emotional support of hate speech targets, and it's certainly not an exhaustive survey of hate speech response strategies. Since several weeks have passed since we last met, we'd like to recap the main ideas from the first two sessions. This will remind us of the context in which we're working. It's important to know that this audience, like the people of Billings, Montana, is full of people who really care about Vancouver. We care about our community, and we desire to foster a strong sense of community and inclusiveness here. This is what we've really learned from the past sessions where we've been together. At a minimum, we assume that you are here because you want to learn about some effective responses to hate speech incidents when they occur. So, as briefly as possible, here's what we've covered so far. For session 1, we examined the key parameters set by U.S. Supreme Court rulings considering hate speech regulations. We learned the two principles that are used to interpret the First Amendment's right of free expression. We examined a couple of Supreme Court cases that illustrate the principles, and we also learned about a counter-perspective to the status quo view that the Supreme Court's rulings to date are sufficient for limiting expression deemed as hate speech. Although we cited a lot of divergent sources about this debate, we relied significantly on Nadine Strossen's 2018 book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It, with Free Speech and Not Censorship. This text, which we encourage you to read, really gives a thorough overview of the generally accepted current understanding of how the Supreme Court interprets the First Amendment parameters for regulating hate speech.
We learned, unlike other developed democratic countries, the US currently does not have laws specifically recognizing hate speech as a prohibited category of expression. We also learned about a crucial distinction for us to make when considering any proposed regulation of so-called hate speech. That is, between hate speech that is presently protected by the First Amendment, separate from hate speech that is not constitutionally protected. So, Strossen's quote here is a nice summary of it. Although the Supreme Court has never recognized a special category of hate speech that is excluded from First Amendment protection, based on its message alone, government may restrict some speech with a hateful, discriminatory message if in context it directly causes specific, imminent, serious harm. That is to say, the emergency test, which we will review here in a second. So we showed you some examples of how the spectrum of language and action works to illustrate this distinction. So on the left, you see a column of hate speech examples that are currently protected by the First Amendment. In this country, you can burn a cross in general. The National Socialist Party of America was able to march peacefully through Skokie, Illinois in the 70s. Offensive political rhetoric. The Supreme Court has recognized political speech as a very important category for protection. So even if it strikes people as hate speech or offensive, they've pretty much unanimously thrown out challenges to that. The middle column are examples of hate speech not protected by the First Amendment. You can't burn a cross on a particular family's lawn. You can't use targeted harassing phone calls to intimidate some individual. And we shared an example of some brand new employees at a new company on their first day of week encountering nooses in the break room the first day they walked in. On the right-hand column, you see criminal actions also involving language, but they're also not protected by the First Amendment. You can't commit bribery, fraud, libel, perjury, true threats, vandalism, or incite a riot. Note that when words cause specific harm to a specific person, they are not protected by the First Amendment. However, when the expression is offensive but unfocused on a specific target, or is clearly political speech, then the Supreme Court has ruled that the First Amendment protects such expression. We learned about two constitutional tests for regulations that aim to limit expression deemed as hate speech, which are: does the incident of perceived hate speech constitute an emergency? And then also, in choosing to regulate speech, any government entity must not punish so-called hate speech, or for that matter, any speech conveying a particular point of view, merely because some of us, or even the vast majority of us, consider its views or ideas objectionable or even abhorrent. This is called the viewpoint neutrality test. So, just to recap your memory in a little bit more detail about the first principle, it goes like this. Under this test, the government may punish speech about public issues only when, in context, it poses an emergency. Only when it directly, and these adjectives are really important if you want to think about something to take away. And by the way, this presentation and these slides are all available on circleofpeaceonline.org, which is listed on the back of the resources there. You can also see the videos of the previous presentations if you're worried about remembering any of these details. So only when it directly, demonstrably, and imminently causes a certain specific, objectively ascertainable serious harm that cannot be averted by non-censorial measures, and the most important of which is counter-speech and law enforcement. So recall that this definition entails that if an individual's specific words directly lead to specific harmful actions as limited by the words of this test, then the person's speech might be curtailed in some way, or they might face other legal consequences. Currently, though, expression using hateful words in and of themselves is protected by the First Amendment.
So the second test is the viewpoint neutrality test. And to refresh your memory about how this works, the viewpoint neutrality test is sometimes referred to as content neutrality, This principle bars government entities from regulating speech solely because the speech's message, idea, or viewpoint is disfavored or feared to be dangerous by government officials or community members. As the court has explained in its rulings, any such viewpoint-based or viewpoint discriminatory regulation would subvert not only individual liberty, but also our entire democratic self-government because of the danger that officials would enforce it to suppress unpopular ideas or information or to manipulate public debate. When thinking about what to expect from government agencies in responding to hate speech, it's important to remember that the viewpoint neutrality test safeguards Americans' free speech rights from government regulation based on the content of the speech. As Nadine Strossen puts it, once the government is authorized to suppress speech because of a feared harmful tendency or because of a disturbing viewpoint, the government has largely unfettered censorial power. In other words, if the government is given the power to decide to shut down speech because an idea seems harmful or distressing to some people, then any idea could be shut down. To understand how the debate is playing out, we also learned in our first session about a counterview. A new body of scholarship, including writers like Andrew Marantz, are now challenging us to think more rigorously about those on the margins who typically end up being targets of hate speech, and how an overly narrow focus on free speech rights devalues the rights of those who are systematic targets of hate speech. So this is one of the things that he had to say. Free speech is a bedrock value in this country, but it isn't the only one. Like all values, it must be held in tension with others, such as equality, safety, and robust democratic participation. We also learned from Shannon Gilraith, who is a professor of law at Wake Forest University, who argues that we should officially recognize in the law a narrower subclass of hate speech called anti-equality speech. Anti-equality speech reinforces systematic equality for targeted groups and often precedes physical harm of those groups. It sows fear, and that can lead to silencing marginalized people in our country. A lax and uncritical tolerance of anti-equality speech, Gilraith argues, contributes to maintaining a de facto two-tier society because it can help to prevent its targets from participating fully in the workplace and in democratic life. For example, when an influential or dominant set of people are bombarded with the false claim that homosexuality causes gay men to rape children, they might be less apt to hire a qualified gay man for a teaching position. The issue here, according to Gilraith and other scholars like him, is that targets of anti-equality speech need protection under the law so they are not penalized for someone else's opinions of them and their demonstrably false beliefs about them.
So, following a small group discussions on some of these questions, we reconvened here the next Monday on October 28th to learn about who usually benefits from the climate of hate speech as it currently plays out in America. And our speaker on October 28th was Circle of Peace member Shireen Elkshari, who works here locally in IT. And as you can see, he's an active member in our community. Thanks, Shireen. So Shireen's talk focused on the way that previously marginalized hate groups who fostered hate speech language through old school methods are currently mainstreaming their message via new technology platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and other social media. As a result, susceptible people are more easily absorbed into these movements and radicalized. So if we are to respond effectively to hate speech, we must develop what we're calling media literacy, which demonstrates awareness of the impact of this new technology. So his assertion was that hate creates movements, and movements create money, power, fame, and political goals. He also pointed out that the followers of hate groups are usually motivated by grievances that in and of themselves might deserve our sympathy, or at least better understanding. Some of the followers truly believe that some kind of real threat is about to happen, and it nurtures their animosity and their rage. If we're to place blame on someone, it's the leaders who start these movements and harness that animosity from their followers to target scapegoats. So Shireen clarified how all kinds of people benefit from hate speech, which feeds off of a polarized society, as well as our inherent tribal instincts and our fight or flight responses. For example, irresponsible politicians who are interested in votes or leverage, religious leaders, they're interested in things like social homogeny, ethnic cleansing. And examples he gave were Muslims in Saudi Arabia, the Hindu BJJ party in India, Buddhists terrorizing Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and Uyghur Muslims targeted by the Communist Chinese. Also, other common groups that benefit from hate speech, of course, are racists. They're interested in creating some kinds of movements or lifestyles that reinforce their belief and gain popularity. And terrorists, they're interested in justifying and promoting violence, either through militias or armed groups. And these, of course, lead to movements that we see. Now, he illustrated, he helped us understand the changing nature of how people benefit from hate speech by illustrating the difference, starting with old school methods, such as this newsletter that someone had to laboriously type out using typewriters. And back then there was little or no financial reward involved. Unlike today's internet, where hate mongers can remain anonymous, hate group meetings in the past, they had to meet face to face, and they risked ridicule when they decided to go public. It kind of took a real labor of love to maintain these movements. Contrast that with what's going on today. Now, technology has made it very easy to spread a spectacle of hate for money. Various platforms make it easy to spread real-time tweets and photos, self-publish manifestos, and create widely distributed videos. Viewers can easily share these ideas and images with a simple click. When producers use these platforms, they can instantly receive data about viewership statistics as well as revenue generated. And to give an example here, we couldn't darken this chart, unfortunately, but the gist of it is, with this particular example, that for 397,000 minutes of watch time, you can make about $200 a month consistently through ad revenue, which may seem like a lot of viewer time, but this breaks down worldwide to a mere 1,000 viewers at about 14 minutes daily engagement over the period of about a month. So Shireen helped us see how YouTube is now the fulcrum of these suite of technologies. Before explaining this graphic, we thought it was really important for you to know that YouTube has recently tried to address this problem more proactively. And if you're really curious, we included in our resources page a new video from YouTube where they explain their new hate speech policy. But regarding the graphic that Shireen used, so the items above YouTube, like text messages, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, memes, Reddit, Pinterest, etc., they push traffic toward YouTube, and then YouTube generates ad revenue. The items below YouTube in the graphic are things that can be done to increase revenue outside of YouTube. So if I'm a YouTube creator, I can build my audience. I can then perhaps organize conferences, sell merchandise, ebooks, Patreon sponsorship, super chat, etc. There's ways of making money in this new era that we live in. Please write down your questions. We're going to answer all of them as we can at the end, okay? Some of you may already know, if you know anything about these technologies, that the algorithms in Facebook, for example, or in YouTube, can push a viewer down the rabbit hole of hate by suggesting similar content that the viewer had previously watched. This, of course, contributes to the echo chamber effect that keeps people in a state of groupthink, where they're shielded from counterviews that might otherwise moderate their opinions.
So, after all of that recap, background, and summary, this brings us to tonight's focus: how we can effectively respond to this climate of hate. Our primary sources represent a variety of views. We've really tried to make sure that they are experts in the field who write for or are quoted by reputable publishers and news outlets. And we've really tried to avoid representing extreme positions on either side due to questionable reliability of sources. So there's a growing library about how to respond to hate speech. We've listed many of the better resources on the handout. We keep referring to that, but there's just so much to learn. But for tonight's presentation, we've drawn from three main sources. Why We Hate is the first source we're going to bring up. This is currently showing on the Discovery Channel. It's a 6-part TV series produced by Steven Spielberg and Alex Gabre that delves deeply into the psychology and phenomenon of hate and its public expression. Another source we have drawn from is The Coddling of the American Mind, which is written by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. Together, they examine the current climate on U.S. college campuses. And what we found is that there are calls there for stricter hate speech policies. Students are disinviting controversial speakers, and in general, there's an intolerance for views that might challenge one's own beliefs. These have all increased dramatically since 2012. So we'll share some of these men's examples with you tonight. And then our third main source is drawn from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an organization that's been monitoring, litigating, and responding to hate groups since 1971. So they have a commitment to educating people about ways to respond to hate and how to inoculate their communities. So we draw tonight from their expertise, and their 10 Ways to Fight Hate Community Resource Guide is also linked in your resource sheet. So, as we consider successful strategies for overcoming impulsive judgments that eliminate the possibility of real communication, let's use this graphic example as our model. So moral actions stem from the habits of mind we cultivate on a regular basis, on a daily basis. If we think in terms of gardening, we know that good harvests can only come from really carefully prepared and rich soil. So in other words, we best prepare ourselves for public action by cultivating our minds through education and mindfulness. This evening, we will further our understanding of hate speech by looking at how the topic is playing out in the realm of youth culture in schools and universities, online culture, and also interactions in the public sphere. If we prepare ourselves by understanding these particular scenarios, we'll just know better how to respond when faced with situations.
So if we think of colleges and universities as training grounds for the country's future leaders, then current campus debates about hate speech and free speech should concern us all. A strong democracy relies on a robust exchange of ideas. But if citizens are afraid of causing offense or of being labeled as bigoted or insensitive, they are more likely to hold their opinions to themselves. One author, as we've mentioned, we've cited before, who's intimately familiar with this debate is Jonathan Haidt. He's the professor of sociology and ethical leadership at New York University. So to combat an unhelpful climate of political correctness on campuses and in our public discussions on hate speech, Haidt and his colleague George Lukianoff recommend that we counteract what they call the culture of safetyism. And they suggest that by finding the right balance between sensitivity to hurtful language and, on the one hand, and freedom of inquiry on the other, we'll be in the right spot to make progress. To accomplish this, they argue that in our learning communities and in our public debates regarding hate speech, that we should actively challenge what they call the three pillars of the culture of safetyism, or the three great untruths. And those are: explicitly reject the untruth of fragility, the idea that what doesn't kill you, it makes you weaker. Explicitly reject the untruth of emotional reasoning, that we should always trust our feelings. And to reject the untruth of us versus them, that life is always a battle between good people and evil people. So, what better person to hear from than Jonathan Haidt himself? And the title of this video is listed I listed up here. It's called The Three Great Untruths. This presentation will be available, as we said, online, thecirclepeaceonline.org, and you can come back and watch it if you're curious. But you can also just search it under this title.
So my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, was a collection of 10 insights from sages around the world that were psychological truths. And one of them is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That gets at the idea, the psychological principle, of anti-fragility. It's a wonderful term. That's actually a clunky, ugly term, but it was made up by Nassim Taleb because we don't have a word for this in English language, which is that there are some systems that get stronger if they get pushed around, knocked around. So a wine glass is fragile. If you knock it over, it breaks. Nothing good happens. A plastic cup is resilient. If a kid throws it off the table, it doesn't break, but nothing good happens. But there's some things that have to get thrown off the table. There's some systems that have to get pushed around. And Taleb wrote this book, Anti-Fragile, or Anti-Fragility, because things like the banking system had to be tested, or it gets fragile and collapses. Bones have to be tested, used, or they get weak. If you were to fly to Mars, your bones would get weak. The immune system, if you protect kids from bacteria, if you keep them in a sterile environment, you're damaging your immune system. The immune system has to face challenges in order to learn. Turns out kids are anti-fragile. And when we protect children from unpleasantness, from conflicts, from insults, from teasing, from exclusion, we're preventing their social psychology, we're preventing their social abilities, we're preventing their strength from developing. The subtitle of our book is How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. By overprotecting our children, we are setting them up to be weak, to be more easily damaged, to be more easily discouraged. The next untruth is always trust your feelings. It may sound wise, it may sound romantic, but wise people around the world have noticed that we don't react to the world as it actually is, we react to the constructions, the perceptions. Epictetus said, it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our interpretations of things. This is the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. Aaron Beck, a psychiatrist in the 1960s, noticed that depressed and anxious people have a way of constructing these beliefs that I'm bad, the future is bad, my future, the world is a bad place, and they're mutually reinforcing. And this is the way the world feels to them. And if you can improve their thinking and break up those beliefs, they're released from the depression. What we've begun seeing on campus is that students are encouraged to follow their feelings. If they feel offended by something, then they have been attacked. They're supposed to not question those feelings. But part of wisdom is the ability to say, now wait a second, are there other ways to look at this? These are crucial skills for critical thinking. These are crucial skills for mental health. And we need to be teaching young people at all stages to question their first interpretations, look for evidence, and improve the way they interpret the world. The third great untruth, my favorite, the worst and most dangerous and darkest of all, is that life is a battle between good people and evil people. If you think about it for a moment, who are we? What is our species? We evolved in small-scale societies that were locked in struggle with other small-scale societies. Human nature is really, really finely tailored for intergroup conflict, for tribal warfare. This is the way our ancestors lived for a long time. Now that we've transcended it, we're so desperate for it, we've invented team sports, fraternities. We love these sorts of competitions. Our brains are made for it. Now, it can be fun, or it can get dark, and it can lead to racism, all kinds of forms of bigotry. If we're creating multi-ethnic environments on campuses, and in most of our organizations, we're struggling to increase diversity, what you should obviously be doing is turning down the tribal sentiments, is emphasizing what we have in common. But on some college campuses and in some high schools, we see forms of education, forms of training that teach students to make more and more distinctions, to see more and more binary dimensions between people, where the people who are high are bad, the people who are low are good. The more we encourage people to see the people around them as good versus evil, the harder it's going to be to create an inclusive, diverse environment. The bottom line is that there are some very basic, important psychological principles. If we're going to raise kids and educate them and bring them through schools and universities, we should get our institutions in line with these principles. They are, children are anti-fragile, we are all prone to motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, and we're all prone to tribalism and black and white thinking. We need to be educating kids so that they do less of this stuff. If we want to raise a generation of kids who can deal with diversity of all kinds, who can go out into a world that's physically actually quite safe, but yet full of offensive content, we need to get our educational practices in line with these three psychological principles, not with the three great untruths.
Uh-oh. No, we don't want to watch that again. We've seen it once. Okay. So we chose this video in part because he's a pretty eloquent person. He's really involved in a lot of the discussions that are happening around right now in the public sphere about our problems of hate speech and how to wisely respond to it. We heard from our audience, the first series in particular, and also in the second one, that people are really interested in what do we do for how do we reach out to younger people? And we saw that Jonathan Haidt was a person in particular who was talking about that. So we decided to bring his voice into this conversation. So their third piece of advice helps us to appreciate the diversity of our communities and avoid being intentionally hurtful with our words, yet also preserve space for confronting difficult truths that may put us in a defensive state of mind. In the learning communities of public schools and universities, they caution community leaders, as you heard, to explicitly reject this untruth. Now, for example, they say, given the diversity of the incoming class, including international students, it is a good idea to talk about the many ways that students unwittingly offend and exclude each other, especially in this technologically supercharged age. However, to balance that insight, they say we need to encourage politeness and empathy without framing issues as microaggressions. They have concerns about this term. It will be interesting to hear your thoughts about that in the discussion. They say that this can reinforce a groupthink state of mind and unnecessarily foster in young people an unconscious habit of defensiveness, where it conditions them for a kind of hypervigilance, where they're looking for the next slight coming their way. Try instead, they suggest, to use a more charitable frame. For example, perhaps a functional family where people give each other the benefit of the doubt. And when problems arise, try to resolve them privately and informally rather than post them on social media and get everybody's, defensiveness worked up. That was an insight that they had. So this concept of microaggressions is one thing that we saw a lot in the literature. It's something that a lot of young people are using right now, and some adults just kind of scratch their heads and kind of say, So we're definitely seeing a generational divide when we are looking at the way these debates about hate speech seem to be unfolding in the public. Interestingly, the Why We Hate series, episode 2, Understanding Tribalism, echoes the insights about groupthink from Haidt and Lukianoff. And we've linked on the resources their discussion guide, and on each of those discussion sessions, they have a takeaway. And the takeaway for this particular episode is love for our group and its members, also known as tribalism, can sometimes lead to distrust and hate of other groups. This group-based thinking shapes our behavior in many ways, one of which is preventing us from seeing or being open to other perspectives. One way to change this is to determine opportunities to step outside the boundaries of our own ideas and beliefs. Now, this picture was from the New York Times, the Ann Arbor News, republished on the New York Times. You've probably heard a lot about this in the news, where a common phenomenon on many college campuses these days is where students are stepping up in the middle of speeches that they deem to be hateful or containing a hateful message, and then they're preventing the person from speaking. So, our society's attempt to find the right balance between the sensitivity to hurtful language on the one hand and freedom of inquiry on the other is admittedly a messy project. We're going to make mistakes. Our first session on October 21st reviewed how the U.S. Supreme Court preferred the approach of practicing counter speech over censorship of views that were seen even by the vast majority of people of being hateful or abhorrent. But this leads to some interesting questions. What exactly are the proper boundaries of counter speech? Should counter speech be devoid of outrage or what some might call righteous anger? Should young people be encouraged to disrupt expression of views in a public forum that trigger them or represent, in their minds, what they call a hateful agenda? Should deplatforming be encouraged? Now, we present these as questions because they come out of this topic. We don't necessarily have any answers to them tonight, but certainly it should be something that you might want to think about in our discussion period. We were also inspired by historian, bioethicist, and author Alice Dreger's emphasis on the necessary connection between truth and justice. She says, carpe datum. Evidence really is an ethical issue, the most important issue in a modern democracy. If you want justice, you must work for truth. And if you want to work for truth, then you must do a little more than just wish for justice. So our brains have been organized by evolutionary pressures to prioritize survival functioning over an accurate grasp of reality. Understanding this can help us to moderate our impulsive reactions in our experience. This, of course, doesn't mean that all of our initial intuitions about injustice are categorically always flawed. However, knowing that we're susceptible to groupthink, to impulsive judgments about our environments, and to biases against outgroups can steer us toward more caution and more rigor concerning our first perceptions of injustice. Why We Hate Episode 1, The Origins of Hate, offers this takeaway. Humans have evolved to perceive threats as a survival mechanism. However, without accurate information, we can form misconceptions that lead to feeling fear or hate. Having an opportunity for new experiences can impact and challenge our beliefs. They urge us to take a mindful approach to how hate originates, and hopefully that will lead us from hate to hope.
So, if we return to our evening's graphic model, we see that we are rooting ourselves in education in order to better understand how to operate in the world. We've just examined some of the issues present on college campuses and how they might spill over into the general democratic life. Shireen's presentation a couple of weeks ago really got into the idea of online culture and understanding how some of those systems work can help us be on guard with those. The last area that we'd really like to take a look at is the public sphere and some really realistic ways that we can respond when we're faced with challenges. We'll be drawing from the Southern Poverty Law Center's 10 Ways to Fight Hate resource for people. Those ideas are just so helpful and so tried and true that we'll simply present them to you. So, our first responsibility, as we saw in Billings, is to act. As people from Billings said repeatedly, they wanted and needed to show a united front against white supremacists because they were each other's neighbors. They all hoped that the community would stand in solidarity with them if they were targeted. And, as the SPLC says, do something. In the face of hatred, apathy will be interpreted as acceptance by the perpetrators, the public, and worse, the victims. Community members must take action, because if we don't, hate persists. Secondly, join forces. If a community is to inoculate itself against hate, then we must join forces. Again, Billings serves as an excellent model for us. We can reach out to allies from churches, schools, clubs, and other civic groups. We can create a diverse coalition of people. We could and should include children, police, and the media. Everyone has an idea, and everyone deserves to get involved. Tip number 3 is to support the victims, because hate crimes and hate crime victims are especially vulnerable. So if you learn about a hate crime victim in your community, it's incumbent on all of us to show support. We can let victims know we care, surround them with comfort and protection. Sometimes in offering this, humor can be effective. And we really want to show you a way that humor was used to counter a hateful expression in the realm of European soccer or European football. So here's the example. Several years ago, Barcelona defender Dani Alves was on the pitch when an opposition fan threw a banana down on him. He responded by picking it up and eating it. His decision inadvertently sparked a social media campaign against racism in European football, as support flooded in from fellow professionals as well as fans all over the place. So Luis Suarez posted a picture on Twitter of himself and Liverpool teammate Philippe Coutinho taking bites out of bananas along with the words, "Say no to racism," and #we are all monkeys. Even Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi and Italy coach Cesare Prandelli joined the campaign. So this doesn't always have to be serious doom and gloom. According to Southern Poverty Law Center, another job we have to do is to speak up. The fourth principle is to speak up because goodness has a First Amendment right also. Hate must be exposed and denounced. We can help news organizations achieve balance and depth. It's best not to debate hate group members in conflict-driven forums. I think we can imagine how badly that could go. And instead, our job is to speak up in ways that draw attention away from hate and toward unity. So there's a tremendous opportunity here for creativity and some good fun. So again, here's an example from Dayton, Ohio. A KKK-affiliated white supremacist group planned a rally in the city's courthouse square this past May 2019, and only 9 people showed up, but the whole town showed up. And here's an example of that. Oh, I forgot to warn you, some of the signs are a little sketchy, so just be prepared for maybe rated PG-13 signs.
Oopsie.
Oh, sorry. Whoop. We were a little unsure about this because of the signs, but thought we'd warn you.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Let's
Sorry.
see if this goes better.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Let's try that again. Yeah, we decided to follow the U.S. Supreme Court's example and let you decide if this is an effective, some of the signs that you see from the businesses are an effective means of combating. So just be prepared for that.
Come out because Dayton is definitely my city, and we don't tolerate any of this here, and so we're speaking out against the KKK being here.
Thanks.
This will get picky again.
Yeah, don't be picky.
Here we go. There you go.
Okay. So the fifth principle from the SPLC is to educate yourself. An informed campaign improves its effectiveness. Determine if a hate group is involved and research its symbols and agenda. Understand the difference between a hate crime, and a bias incident. Clearly, if you witness an incident, you need to figure out, have you witnessed a hate crime? Because if so, you need to dial 911. And if you've simply witnessed a bias incident, then maybe the best response is to get organized.
I'm up and down one. The SPLC's sixth tip was to create an alternative. They recommend do not attend a hate rally. So don't get in these people's faces and get into arguments where, maybe they have some kind of social media site and then they are sometimes very adept at making people look foolish, or they've practiced their scripts. Instead, find another outlet for anger and frustration and for people's desire to do something. So, for example, you could hold a unity rally or parade to draw attention away from the hate. it's a keen and a very important point to pressure leaders as well. Elected officials and other community leaders can be important allies. Some, however, might have to overcome their reluctance or in some cases their own biases before they're able to take a stand. Their 8th tip is to stay engaged. Promote acceptance and address bias before another hate crime in your community can occur. Expand your comfort zone by reaching out to people outside your own groups. So I don't know if you know it or not, but every September here in Vancouver, we host a Peace and Justice Fair at Esther Short Park, and we have many groups in town who are working on fostering peace in our community. If you are part of a religious community or a nonprofit agency or some other group, you might ask your group, how can you reach out to another group and make a connection? So one excellent way to do that, and to be engaged here locally, is to attend a Better Angels workshop. This organization was launched in 2016, and it's a national citizens movement to bring together liberals and conservatives at the grassroots level. Not for any kind of centrist compromise, but to find one another as citizens. Through their workshops or their debates and campus engagement, Better Angels helps Americans understand each other beyond stereotypes, to form community alliances, and to reduce the vitriol that poisons our civic culture. So Circle of Peace's own Dan Sokol has led Better Angels workshops here at the library as well as around the region. If you're interested, be sure to grab a handout over there that Kelly's holding up right now before you leave. Their ninth tip is, of course, to start young, to teach acceptance. Bias is learned early, they say, often at home. Schools or other kinds of organizations like churches can offer lessons in tolerance and acceptance. It's really important as an adult with your voice to reach out to young people who, in your judgment, may be susceptible to hate group propaganda or prejudice. And what we saw in our research is a lot of that stuff is happening online. So if you're a parent or a grandparent, talking to your loved ones and helping them to wisely shepherd young people while they're going down rabbit holes online can be a really good idea. So consider how it might feel to be a young person in the country right now. We have learned that schools in our community with high Latino populations are noticing enrollment declining this particular year. Teachers are speculating that parents are keeping their children home because they're afraid of what their kids might encounter when they leave home. Finally, here is our great personal challenge for all of us to look inside ourselves for biases and stereotypes. The SPLC encourages us to commit ourselves to disrupting hate and intolerance at home, at school, in the workplace, in whatever community that you happen to belong to. And of course, acceptance here is fundamentally a personal decision. It comes from an attitude, they say, that is learnable and embraceable, a belief that every voice matters, that all people are valuable, and that no one is less than. So, clearly we've examined some challenging topics and ideas in this series, and we have plenty of work to do to maintain our relationships and to continue to create a world where democracy can flourish. Sometimes the best way to act, though, is to slow down and to quiet our minds first. So when we return to our model, we see that practicing mindfulness is one of the habits of mind that we can use to ground all of our public interactions. Now, this next research is really interesting to me personally, and when I've been talking to other folks out there in a workplace setting or just in the community, a lot of folks are kind of talking about this. It seems to be really interesting. So, it appears that regular practice of mindfulness meditation appears to change people's brains to better regulate strong emotions. And Why We Hate episode 6, Turning Hate into Hope, clarified this in some detail. They said, even though the foundations of hate may be biological, we can use science to help understand it and move past it. Individuals have the power to change others' ways of thinking, as our brains are made to adapt and change. The first step is having an open perspective to the way that we think about the world around us and identifying what can be changed, and then setting an example for others. So I really encourage you to watch this series. It's quite fascinating. They interviewed a Dr. Richard Davidson. He's the director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. And he explained this research from this bottom slide down here in the following way. He says, we can say with a fair amount of confidence that there are two major circuits in the brain that are impacted by meditation. One are circuits that are important for regulating attention, and the other are circuits that are important for regulating emotion. These are called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that's right here behind your eyebrows, which is a newer part of our brain, and it's involved in emotion regulation. And the amygdala, in the old part of our brain here, is an area that's strongly regulated by fear. And in their research, what they found is that the connectivity between these regions seems to be significantly strengthened in long-term meditators as opposed to those who are just starting to meditate. As you can see in the picture here, a lot of folks who are participating in this are our military veterans who are coming back from being stationed overseas in combat, and a lot of them have PTSD. And not connected to any kind of religious tradition at all, just a purely secular practice of mindfulness meditation. They've been doing studies and looking and seeing these changes. And Dr. Davidson says that this is one of the key changes that are produced by even simple forms of mindfulness meditation. So we'd like to leave you tonight with some hopeful thoughts from Why We Hate. They say that the human brain is pliable and it's made to learn and change. Hate can be unlearned, and often it's the acts of kindness that are the dislodging elements. So we're summarizing a lot of research here. In episode 6 in particular, they followed some people who had experienced some trauma from hateful encounters, and their behavior was significantly affected by those kinds of encounters. And when practicing the mindfulness meditation as one example, there's other ways to do it, like cognitive behavioral therapy. These people can see progress in the way that their anxiety is lessened. Their ability to enter into tense situations is not as frustrating or disturbing for them as it was before. And it was the kindness elements that they encountered in their life that allowed their trust to return. So creating peace relies on structural responses from leaders as well as the psychological responses from citizens. And there's definitely an interplay between the two. Okay, so we've given you guys a lot of background information tonight, and it's important for we take time to talk about this together. And we're going to do that in some small groups here. But first, if you could please look at the handout that we gave you that has the conversation agreements at the top. So this is from the Living Room Conversations model, and if you were here the first time, you had participated in this before. You're familiar with this already. The Living Room Conversations model is a model of public interaction, public discussion that the library has used in the past. And there are certain kinds of things that they just ask that you be mindful of as you enter into this discussion with your fellow Vancouver citizens. So one, they suggest to be curious and open to learning. I'll let you read the smaller print underneath each one. Please show respect and try to suspend judgment. Try to find common ground and note where you have differences as well. Please be authentic and welcome that from others. Very important, be purposeful and to the point. Try not to dominate if you can. Be mindful of how much time you are using in the conversation. And then try to own and guide the conversation to move it forward. We've all been part of discussions that haven't really worked, so let's make a commitment this evening to take turns and to listen to each other. So you can see that we have some questions here for you. And what we're going to do in a moment here is we're going to break you into 2 small groups. We'll just circle up in some chairs and...
The group has gotten bigger. I think we should have groups of 3 to 4.
Okay, we'll do groups of 3. How does that sound? And so these are the questions, and we've given you some choice here to think about them. First, we'd like you to take a moment to share something, a moment when you personally made an impulsive judgment about someone during a contentious discussion, and how the communication went awry as a result. How did you come to recognize your impulsive judgment and its effects? That's the first option. Or, if you prefer, Briefly share a time when you overcame an impulsive judgment about someone and how that significantly improved the quality of your conversation about a contentious topic. Non-contentious topics, we're probably not really interested in that because we're coming up on Thanksgiving conversations here soon, right? So we want to be prepared for that. And then finally, what's most important, which either one you choose, what did you learn from either experience? Okay, question 2, and you guys can choose whichever one to start with. It doesn't matter. Spend as much time on whichever one you want. Question 2, consider your observations of people caught in the throes of hateful emotions. Briefly share an experience where you witness how, in your judgment, this distorted their ability to understand the reality of the situation or the facts of the issue. What, if anything, enabled you or perhaps someone else to help them back to a more charitable perspective or truthful understanding? Or if you prefer, briefly share an experience where you witnessed a person undergo a transformation away from hate as a default emotion, and what exactly enabled them to do that. Finally, if you'd like, there's question 3. Briefly recount an experience where an individual or a group of individuals were publicly made the targets of hateful language. What effects did this experience appear to have on them, and what did you or could you have done to make them feel supported? So there's 3 great questions here. And what we'd like you to do now, my teacher brain is going to kick in here, so I'm going to get you into some small groups. And we'd like you to just circle up and go ahead and get started on whichever one you're interested in. You can do them randomly or go 1, 2, 3. It's up to you. So we'll have about 40 minutes to have this conversation. We'll float around a bit and check in with you. And then we'll come back together and we'll share out a couple of findings. So let's do this. Let's have a group kind of coalesce right around here, this first corner of the room. Let's have another group coalesce right over there in the middle of the room on that side, and then over here in the corner in the back. Let's have our third group. And if you've come with someone, I give you a personal challenge. Sit in a new group separate from your partner so you can share perspectives when you get home. Okay, let's go.